Recording. Turn off the music. Okay, here we go. Hope everyone's doing well. I hope some people trickle in. I was just saying I suspect that a few people forgot it was daylight savings time. We've only got about 22. I forgot myself. I just noticed it last night. So I forgot to mention it to everybody, but hopefully a few more will come in. Today we're going to cover the issue of power. It's very important, but before we do, just a few administrative things. I had moved the date of the rewrite to next Sunday. So you have an extra week. I made a lot of changes on some people's papers, so you have an extra week to work on those. Are there any questions about that at this point? Nothing? Let me see, the light looks a little weird for some reason. Let me see if I can. Does it help? Does that help? No, that doesn't help. How about that? Maybe that helps. I think it's a little better. So, oh, here's Alexis. All right. I'll hold off on taking attendance for a few minutes. Maybe a few more people will wake up and realize I see their clocks automatically turn back. But anyway, the power here's okay. So power is, I would say, the second most important topic after what we did last week, communication. They're both equally important. I mean, a large part of the reason communication is important is that it influences your ability to exercise power and influence. So I think it's certainly close or equal to communication in importance. The reason I think communication is even more important is that not everybody wants to gain power. It's a taste that some people have and others don't. David McClellan, the psychologist who wrote about really the basis of this course, he created the idea of competencies, and he wrote extensively about human needs and how they impact economic development. And one of McClellan's key needs is the need for power. He also he thought it was more important for society that people have what he called the need for achievement, which we'll talk about when we do motivation. But power and achievement are two different things. Power, literally means power over others, that you gain some kind of control or authority over others, whereas achievement means that you create something on your own. And for society as a whole, it doesn't really matter that much whether one person has power or another. That matters to those people. Whether the Democrats get elected or the Republicans, it matters to people's taste. It could conceivably affect development in the longer run, but the way it would, according to McClellan, is that if a society emphasizes the need for power or other needs over the need for achievement, then the society won't develop. Whereas the societies that have a flourishing degree of the need for achievement are the ones that develop. And interestingly, only a few societies in history have been dominated by the need for achievement. In our political discourse today, there's a lot of talk about encouraging equity, fairness, equality, freedom. If you're a conservative, which actually I would call a liberal, but there's very little talk, though, about fostering achievement. And yet, what McClellan found is that the societies that have developed in history the most have had the most need for achievement. Now, how that comes about is unclear in McClellan's writing. I don't think he understood it too well himself, but if you look at the chief industrializing and progressing societies, there were probably the of course you could say the Chinese emperor who put together China out of the warring states. In the West, though, I forgot his name. It was the Qin dynasty. Qin Shi Huang in 221 BC. And it would be interesting to study. I don't think McClellan looked at that period of China, but what had gone on was that there were a lot of states warring with each other and weren't unified, and he unified them. And not that long after, I'm just looking up the year. Actually, it was like 800 years later. The Chinese established the civil service, which was like the first like large scale bureaucracy. So they were like way ahead of the West. It's important to remember that when you talk about societies develop economically. But if you look at the West, the two societies that really two or three societies that did the most to develop were classical Athens, the city-state of Athens, which pretty much developed most of our culture. Most of Western culture came from classical Athens, and that would include subjects like philosophy, science. They didn't have quite the same science, but modern science differs from. There's a great book by Leo Strauss, which is called Natural Law and History, and he talks about the difference between classical Greece and the Enlightenment in terms of what constituted science. And there was really only one chief difference between the two, which was recognized who did I just admit there? Maybe it's time for me to take attendance. All right, I'm going to take attendance now. I'm just getting mixed up as to who I'm admitting here. All right, please answer when I call you. Is Axianova here? Balin?
Here.
Barrios?
Here.
Just corresponded. Brew?
Here.
Canetti? Or Canet?
Here.
Mark Davis?
Here.
Okay, good. Kalen Duvall, Del Valle, Kalen, Farzine Fatima, Adam Gasovic, Yusuf Gahuman,
Here.
Ryan Goluborski,
Here.
Helen Gorelli,
Here.
Shyla Hicks, Shuki Hu,
Here.
Liana King Merritt,
Here.
Christina Kuchenko,
Here.
Jessica Liao, Zhuo Jun Lin.
Here.
Okay,
Sorry, Professor. This is Jessica. I'm here.
Jessica Liao. Okay, got it. Shyla Hicks.
Here.
I lost track of where I was. Zhuo Jun, did you say you were here?
Yeah, I'm here, Professor.
Thank you. Lyrian,
Here.
Samantha,
Here.
Megan,
Here.
Jin Tao,
Here.
Emmanuel, Pierre, Anthony Pilko,
Here.
Talim, Mohammed,
Here.
Alexis,
Which Alexis?
Rojas,
Oh,
Here.
Melina,
Here.
Kasim,
Here.
Anthony Truong,
Here.
Anna Vargas.
Here.
Okay, we've got almost everyone now. Jean Wong,
Here.
Alexis Huang,
here.
Lotta.
Here.
Okay, I'm going to just call the people I didn't mark present. If you're here, speak now. Veronica, Emmanuel Canetti.
Here.
Okay. Hao Dong,
Here.
Kaylin Delval. I'm sorry, Delval. Kaylin Delval. Farzine Fatima. Adam Kasovic. And Talim Pridgen. All right. Okay, so I was saying Francis Bacon defined the difference between classical Athenian science and Enlightenment science, chiefly in the use of mathematics. It wasn't the experimental method which had been devised. Aristotle, for example, used dissection, and there was use of the experimental method in classical Greece. But they also invented things like history, trial by jury, democracy, philosophy, and lots of other stuff that we take for granted. Even abolitionism, the abolition of slavery, was debated then, although it existed in almost every society at that time. Of course, they didn't abolish it then. Aristotle himself thought it was acceptable, but it took 2,400 years or something like that, 2,350 years for most societies to abolish slavery. But amazingly, even today, it's not totally abolished. So basically, if you look at classical Greece and you look at Great Britain in the time of industrialization, which was like probably the biggest economic advance in history, along with laissez-faire economics, free market economics, that was also devised there, and the explosion of entrepreneurship that led to the establishment of larger industrial firms that could produce large quantities of output. This all occurred under laissez-faire capitalism. If you look at those developments, those were the chief economic periods of development of the last 2,500 years. They were characterized, according to McClellan, by the need for achievement. The way he studied it was he looked at the literature of those cultures and of those periods and looked for systematic appearance of words, specific words that were associated with achievement. And then he took it further. He took the analysis further and studied a wide range of cultures cross-sectionally by correlating the quantity of electrical output by society, which is an indicator of industrialization, with the achievement-oriented language in children's school books. And he found a significant correlation. So he used both historical and cross-sectional quantitative data to verify this association of achievement orientation with economic development. The criticism a lot of scholars have of McClellan's work is that it was tautological. The word tautology means that, let me put this on the board so you see the word. Hopefully you're looking at the screen. Tautology or tautological means that something follows logically. So you're not really, in logic, if you say something like if A, then not A, double not A equals A, and the reverse, the opposite's also true. If not A is false, then A is true. So that's tautological. So that's good for logic, but if you are finding results in an empirical study that are tautological, it means you haven't really found anything, because tautological reasoning is always correct. So you're not adding any information. And a lot of people have criticized McClellan by saying that the only time you will have advance is when there's a lot of achievement. And so if you call something the need for achievement, it must be related to advance, because achievement is logically related to advance and need for achievement is logically related to achievement. And that's to say that the people who criticize him are saying that the concept of need for achievement is vacuous, that there's no real meaning to it, that all it is associated with achievement itself, which in turn is logically associated with economic development. The problem is that there is some content to achieve need for achievement, that there are certain traits that people have, such as that they're moderate risk takers. That people with high need for achievement will take risks that are likely to succeed 50% of the time. They're likely to have goals and things like that. And part of what the goal setting exercise does is try to get you to think like people who have need for achievement. Now, ironically, that said, now that I've told you all about how important need for achievement is, the need for power is different from the need for achievement. And while there are undoubtedly people who have both a strong need for achievement and a strong need for power, one who comes to mind right away is Bill Gates, who's a power hound and also was a strong achiever, building writing the earliest, the operating system for the earliest PC, and building one of the first major software companies to compete with IBM, and so on. So, and of course he was competing with Steve Jobs back in that period. And, that HBO film, The Pirates of Silicon Valley, is sort of a really good semi-fictional. I won't call it historical, it's semi-fictional, but in some ways close to reality. There's no question that Microsoft pirated a lot of Apple's ideas in establishing Windows, and there's no doubt that Apple had pirated Xerox, who was the real inventor of the modern operating system, and just didn't capitalize on it. So anyway, the need for achievement is not the same as the need for power. Somebody who wants to build a really great company may not have a strong thirst for power, may not care about power. All they want to do is develop the company. Having control over others is totally ancillary. It can result, because if you're successful and you build a big company, then you do have some power over other people in that they work for you and you can fire them. So that gives you power. But not everybody cares about that. When I first started teaching, people said, well, professors have power over their students because you can fail them. But it always kind of left me indifferent. I never really saw that as like something that would like trigger anything in me. It just didn't. It's not why I would have wanted to teach. To pursue the power. I think someone who would do that, is something wrong with them, in my opinion. But basically, I don't have a lot of respect for the need for power, but there's no question that a lot of people in the world have it. And most of the politicians all have it. And the point is that McClellan found that it's not just the politicians who get ahead because of their need for power, or motivated to get ahead because of their need for power, but it's also executives in large firms who are propelled by the need for power. So McClellan differentiated between people who have the need for personal power, that is, people who are self-serving and use the power for themselves, and people who seek institutional power, that is, people who seek power on behalf of their organizations. And McClellan predicted that entrepreneurs, people who start their own businesses, have a high need for achievement, not power, because when you start the business, you're not really gaining power over anyone. You're the one who's sort of vulnerable. You have to get financing, you have to get customers. You don't have power when you start a business, but achieving, what you're doing is trying to achieve something. So such people like to get things done and demonstrate excellence, whereas top managers in existing companies have a high need for power. When I was an undergraduate, I'd never heard of this. I wrote a philosophical essay for one of my classes, and I distinguished between people who have the need for accomplishment and the need for achievement. And it was almost the same. I don't know how I kind of must have heard it somewhere, maybe just a coincidence, but I saw accomplishment is rising up in an organization, and achievement is creating something from scratch. And that's almost the same idea, that basically you rise up in the organization because of your need for power. Not all cultures see power the same way. Cultures that are ascriptive, that value inherent attributes, cultures that respect traditional roles, or that regard people with a given position in society as legitimate simply because of that position, don't see power as something to attain to the same degree as Americans do. I think the Western attitude towards power was evolving in the 19th century. The great novel by Stendhal, Le Rouge et le Noir, The Red and the Black, about parvenu whose aim is to rise in economic terms, and the red and the black refers to the military and the clergy, and those were the two established institutions in the early 19th century that allowed, and they obviously go back to the Middle Ages, that allowed, or earlier, really to late antiquity, that allowed people to rise in society. So that was changing as free markets created new companies and entrepreneurs beginning in the 1500s. Really, people often say that the Industrial Revolution was in the early 1800s, and then there was a second Industrial Revolution. But if you look historically, the evolution of the textile technology in England, and then the evolution of the use of coal and iron smelting, and then the advancements in steel manufacturing, those all evolved beginning in the late 16th century. So it was a much more gradual process than most people realize. And if you look at that, you listen to that song by Mark Knopfler, the rock star from the 80s, Sailing to Philadelphia, about he was the brains behind Dire Straits, the group back then. And if you listen to that song, Sailing to Philadelphia, it's about two scientists, Mason and Dixon, who were sent to America to draw a border between Maryland and Virginia to end a series of border wars and conflicts that were occurring back then. In the course of the song, which is based on Thomas Pynchon's novel, Mason plus Dixon, Knopfler refers to the coaly tine. And he's absolutely right that by the early 18th century, the British were already using coal quite heavily in industry, which was a major advance. And that's how the West overcame the preeminence of China in terms of its economic dominance in the world. China was the most advanced country economically until the 19th century. And even early American colonials, I think it was one of the early colonial families, I think it was the Lowells, but I'm not sure. I was reading in this book about the early American Whigs, that one of the early families, I think it was the Lowells, sent their son to China to learn the Chinese merchant craft because they were by far the most advanced. So I'm talking about in the early 1700s. So basically, until the 1800s, the Chinese were really the dominant economic force in the world, but they had looked inwardly and didn't see the need, because they were so much more affluent, they didn't quite get the point of industrialization. And that's where smugness leads to decline. I think we're seeing it here now to a degree too. So basically, power plays a very big role in moving up in a large corporation. And as society becomes more politicized, it puts more weight on power. So what we've seen is increasing socialization of the economy, really for the past century, even more since the progressive era in 1900. You've seen increasing intervention in the economy, and the result is increased politicization of the economy. I think it escalated significantly in the 1930s and in the 1960s, but it really came to a head in 2009 with the bailout and the subsidization of a large list of failed companies that were subsidized by the state. So, and what we're seeing now is that more and more corporations are politicized, that they're a big part of their objective is to please the politicians as well as their customers. which does not augur well for American industry. This is an early step on the path to economic decline. Customer-driven markets are the only way firms advance, and if they can't fail, then they can't compete. So basically, Americans, and perhaps my last that last comment is consistent with this, tend to be suspicious of power. They tend to agree with the British philosopher Lord Acton that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But there are many advantages on a personal level to gaining power. So that said, something can be good for you on the individual level, but when it's aggregated on the social level, it ends up in decline. And the pursuit of power over achievement is one of those. So basically, you need to pursue power for yourself, but doing so is an advantage that gains for you. It's not something that gains for someone else. Power is basically a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be, but the way that you expand the amount of power in society is through achievement. Achievement increases the avenues in which power can be exercised, but power itself doesn't increase anything. If you use power, you can redistribute wealth, but you can't create wealth. So when Mao said power comes from the barrel of a gun, he was telling the truth. Basically, you can gain wealth through a stick up or a robbery in power, or you can manipulate your way to the top of an existing corporation, but you can't create new wealth. Because power has been around a lot longer than free market capitalism or industrialization has, which is attendant upon free market capitalism. The philosophizing about power has a somewhat longer history. Aristotle's political science focuses, of course, on the distribution of power. And when you read the great liberal political theorist Montesquieu, his main focus is on power, how to limit power through his most famous contribution is separation and division of powers. And if you go further, a lot of people would argue that modern political science was invented by Machiavelli, the Italian minister and philosopher who had been banished. He had been advisor to the Medici, and he was banished, and he wrote the great classic, The Prince. And in The Prince, Machiavelli argues that the prince should rule through fear rather than love, because you can lose people's love, but you can't lose their fear. And he also advocated using any means necessary. So in other words, it's okay to lie, because you have to use whatever tools are at your disposal to retain power. And this kind of cutthroat approach to power differs significantly from the classical view of Aristotle, which was completely rooted in Aristotle's ethics. So in other words, Aristotle saw politics as a branch of ethics, in effect. They were closely linked. So the Nicomachean ethics is closely related to his discussions of politics. And the way that he described politics was purely as far as how moral the outcome of the political system is. Aristotle didn't believe in democracy, and nor did Machiavelli. Aristotle believed first and foremost in an aristocratic republic. He believed in aristocracy, not in the democracy. And the founding fathers of America did not believe in democracy. This is a frequent misunderstanding. They called it democracy, but they also called it republicanism. And they believed in a balance of different interests and different sources of power, in particular the states versus the general public. And that was, and that was why there were a whole bunch of more complex institutions. For example, senators were not elected directly by the people until the late 19th century. I forget the constitutional amendment to elect senators directly was the 17th Amendment, which was passed in 1913. Yeah, so I was wrong. It was 1913, the early 20th century. So it's only a little over a century that we've had direct election of senators. Have things worked better? Judge for yours. I'll let you judge for yourself. Basically, Machiavelli then thought you should be manipulative in using power. But in today's world, there's not just one prince who has power over others, but we're all like sort of equally seeking power. There's a few people who I would say are equivalent to princes, Gates, Soros, people like that. Are equivalent to princes in Machiavelli's world, but not quite. Even they have limits, as we're witnessing, by the way, with Andrew Cuomo, who was like a czar until about 3 months ago. He could do no wrong. He's always been a crook, but he could do no wrong in the eyes of the New York public. And now suddenly everyone's calling for his resignation. So I think Cuomo proves that there are no real princes in America, that even someone who's that acclaimed can easily fall. So basically, this idea of manipulation doesn't really work that well. Maybe Cuomo was kind of a latter-day Machiavelli, but the thing is, he got caught. And as someone who's elected, he can't really make the people. He tried to make people afraid of him. That guy Kim, that representative Kim, he threatened, and Kim then retaliated, and now Cuomo's in Assemblyman, I think his first name, Assemblyman Kim, Ron Kim. I think he's in Queens or something. And basically, Cuomo's now experiencing the reality that in our society there are no real princes, so we can't really be as manipulative, and it doesn't really work that well. Yeah, Cuomo's intimidating Kim didn't really work. Because we're a more egalitarian society than existed in the day of the Medici. So basically, we have flatter organizations. Companies don't have as many levels as they had even 30 years ago. Technology has caused the decentralization of organizations. Organizations have fewer boundaries. A company like Walmart will manage the processes of its suppliers, even large firms. Vlasic Pickles or Newell Rubbermaid. Rubbermaid, I think, spun off from Newell. But basically, Walmart will actually get involved in their computer system and how they manage themselves and stuff like that. So we have boundaryless organizations, and firms don't tend to be, I don't think the firms are that they're smaller per se. I think what we have is smaller units, that the units are smaller and more flexible. So basically, how do you use power in a world like that, where it's a lot closer to the Greek polis than to the Roman Empire, where in the Greek polis, anyone could serve on the jury. They would pick the archon, the ruler, by lottery. And their democracy only lasted about 80 years. Our so far has lasted about 230 years, if you think we still have a democracy. But basically, the Greek democracy in Athens only lasted about 80 or 100 years, and 90 years, something like that. And basically, they had a lot of what they did was by lottery. They didn't bother with elections, just pick people at random. But they knew they couldn't do that for the military. So they, the head of the military, Pericles, ruled for a long time. The Archon in favor of in control of the military, but otherwise they had a very open democracy. And Solon, early in the period I'm talking about, had redistributed all the debts. He blew away all the debts, and he redistributed the political entities so that the families that had ruled Athens before him were separated from each other. He eliminated a lot of the special interests and the debts, creating a high degree of equality. And the Athenian citizen was responsible for a great number of civic duties, especially military duty. As long as you had some property, you were expected to, you could afford armor, you were expected to fight in the military. So basically, that kind of equality leads to a greater use of influence. And I don't think it's a coincidence that society with that kind of equalization was the society that produced Socrates and his followers, Plato and Aristotle. And basically, Socrates, who was willing to question anything, in a society that's created a great deal of equality, relatively. Of course, there were a huge number of slaves in Athens. 80% of Athens or something was slaves. But what you basically had was a more equal society than had heretofore existed anywhere of any size. I mean, in tribes, yeah, you might have had it, but so you had people like Socrates questioning anything. And we think of the sophists today as liars because Plato characterized them that way. But basically, they were asking a lot of questions and advising people, and that's kind of how you have a free society. When you curtail that, when you say people can't ask questions, or certain kinds of speech are forbidden, you move away from that model and you move into more of the top-down model that we've seen so many times in the 20th century that led to totalitarianism. So basically, how do you handle power in the context of a more equal society? Well, a lot of it we've already talked about: networking, getting to know people, gaining people's trust, and the way that you do that is utilizing two key sources of power: the personal characteristics and the positional characteristics of power. So what are some of the personal characteristics of power? Are you people who are personally attractive, who people who are personally attractive, people who are likable, people who are emotionally accessible, people who can win others over. These are some of the ways that people are going to give you power, but there's other ways too. The four sources of power: expertise. Do you have knowledge? Francis Bacon, who I was just saying, Leo Strauss in that book, Natural Right and History, says that Bacon was the one who created modern science through his grasp that mathematics through his philosophical understanding that mathematics needed to be added, that added the other dimension to science that made it, so powerful in the modern world. That knowledge is power, according to Bacon. So if you know stuff, if you have skill, if you have knowledge, you're going to gain power. But the thing is, you want to avoid what might be called an expertise trap. If you're too specialized in one area, you get locked in the field, and you're not able to move up. You're limited to that field. So expertise, effort, where you put in more effort than other people and you gain power, and legitimacy, where you conform to organizational or social norms. The person who is like their boss, who mirrors their boss and conforms to the boss's ways and the ways of the higher ups and of the organization, tends to be more successful. William F. White was a PhD student when he wrote his dissertation, which was turned into the book Street Corner Society. And he studied street gangs in Boston, and he actually lived with them. And he recognized that the key way that someone became a leader of the gang was to conform to the organizational norms. If the gang was good at stealing, the leader was the best thief. If the gang enjoyed sports, then the leader was if not the best athlete, among the best athletes. So if you look at American society, there's certain norms when we elect politicians. I've never quite understood why. I sometimes feel like I'm a stranger in a strange land, but basically Americans have always elected lawyers to run the country. Why that is, I'll never quite get. Or career politicians. Those seem like the two worst sources of leaders. I think the Greeks had a better idea, just pick people randomly. But in any case, people who conform to the organizational norms are going to rise. So if a norm in America is that lawyers are politicians, then they elect lawyers as politicians. And also generals. I left those out. There have been a few of those. So basically, the leader should fit the norm. So if you're in a corporation where everybody wears a blue suit, you got to wear a blue suit. If you're in a corporation where everyone wears informal clothes like IDEO, then you wear informal clothes. You fit in the way that the organization determines. You mirror the organization. To be successful, you have to understand mirroring. Mirroring means that you study your boss, you study the higher ups, and you adopt the habits of those people. If everyone in the company reads the Wall Street Journal, you should read the Wall Street Journal. Nonconformity is never rewarded. Conformity is. People like people who are like them. Now, that's of course dangerous. We'll talk about that when we do team building, because a tendency in all organizations is the echo chamber, the groupthink. You see it in universities a great deal. You see it on TV. You see it almost everywhere in society, and it's increasing at an increasing pace. So it's increasing all through my life, but the degree of conformity, and it doesn't matter what group you're in, there's always going to be conformity, whether you're like a hippie or a Wall Street lawyer or a military person or business executive. If you're in an organization, there's always going to be some push to conform to the organization. And if you don't conform, you're not going to rise in the organization. So let me summarize the four personal sources of power that you can use in trying to gain power. First of all, personal attraction. Are you likable, good looking, emotionally attractive, physically attractive? Are you honest? People like honesty. Do you give people positive regard? and using the good communication skills we talked about last time, validating, for example, emotionally acceptable. Second of all, expertise. Do you have task relevant knowledge? Can you solve problems that other people can't? But you want to avoid the expertise trap. Third of all, effort, that you put in more effort than everyone else. Of course, in a lot of companies nowadays, everyone puts in a lot of effort. So it's going to be hard to score points that way. Also, in a lot of companies, there's social pressure not to put in extra hours. So like I saw in my HR class a case about the SAS Corporation, SAS, which is one of the largest software companies. And they put a lot of pressure on their employees not to work more than 35 hours. So the hard effort might conflict with culture in some organizations. On the other hand, there are companies where it's so ingrained in the company to work long hours. The investment banks are an example. Traditionally, the investment bankers work 16-hour days and so on. If you put out more effort than your colleagues, if you're able to do that, your boss will like you. You'll create cognitive dissonance. The boss will say, oh, they work as hard as I do, so they must be like me. So now, of course, hard work alone isn't enough. Crucial to any kind of office politics is understanding your boss's goals, your boss's traits, and maintaining a relationship that fits the needs and style of your boss. So, this thing that you're going to achieve something and the boss better like it is not how you succeed in corporate America. Rather, the way that you succeed is through conforming to your boss's needs. All right. So if you're going to create a power plan for yourself, the first thing you want to look at is your boss. Like, what are my boss's patterns of behavior? How am I contributing to them? Do I understand my boss's needs? How can I better understand my boss's needs? How can I understand my boss's goals? What are my boss's behavior patterns? How can I better fit those? All right. So when you put in effort, it should be tailored in that way. It's not effort for its own sake or objectively defined by your preconceptions. Rather, it's understanding your boss's goals. And the fourth one, so I said expertise, personal attraction, effort, and lastly, legitimacy. These are the personal traits of power. Legitimacy meaning conformity to organizational norms. So the person who mirrors their boss and conforms to the boss and also conforms to the organization will be a likely candidate for moving up. All right. Now, what are some traits on a personal level that are associated with lack of power? A lot of what power means is that you gain social capital. We talk a lot about human capital. The idea of human capital is that you invest in yourself, you take care of your health, you take care of your education, you do the right things physically and intellectually in order to, and emotionally in order to develop. Human capital means investment in yourself. Social capital means that you invest in a social network and connections. Managers with a high social output are in a better position to capitalize on their human capital. So building social capital means getting an audience that trusts you. That means networking with people in your field. It means developing a reputation, making contacts, things like that. Okay, people who don't do that, who don't develop long-term relationships are going to have their careers derailed over time. People who are cold, aloof, and arrogant, people who are insensitive to others, people who are overly ambitious and unable to delegate, people who are unable to trust at all. Now, does that mean you should trust somebody 100%? You don't trust people 100%. You trust them to the degree that's necessary to get the job done, but you always monitor what they do. Now, can someone abuse your trust? Of course. Well, one of the common pitfalls in business is that people abuse your trust. An employee steals, a contractor doesn't deliver the goods, a lawyer doesn't work on the case. You're always going to confront these kinds of issues, and you always monitor for it and nip it in the bud when it occurs. You're going to lose something, but you end it as quick as possible. I don't know if it's a 3 strikes and you're out rule. I would say it's probably a 2 strikes and you're out rule. I would say, somebody screws up once, you have a little heart, and forgive that. But if there's a second instance, there seems to be a pattern developing, and there's plenty of fish in the sea, so you don't need to continue to do business with this person. Now, people who derail relationships, who are cold, who are insensitive, who are too ambitious, who don't delegate to others, who don't trust. These kinds of people are the ones who don't have good personal sources of power and will tend to have their careers stalled. So the good sources of power on a personal level are expertise, personal attraction, effort, and legitimacy or conformity. In addition to the personal sources of power, there are also positional sources of power. If you're going to gain power, you have to be targeted at moving into positions that you can leverage into gaining more power. So in other words, you want to target jobs that give you access to additional power. And smart people are conscious of what job to take based on how much power it gives them. There's an anecdote in David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest, which is a wonderful book about the Kennedy administration and the Vietnam War, and how such a smart group of Harvard trained and Harvard faculty, and Yale, also Harvard and Yale, managed to get us into a complete boondoggle that killed probably 1 million Vietnamese, 50,000 Americans, wasted billions and billions of dollars. I forget the exact number. I'm going to look that up. I need to know that. Cost of the Vietnam War. That 843 billion, which today doesn't sound like a lot because we do trillions, but if you adjust for inflation, it's more like 4 trillion or something. So basically, or at least 2 or 3 trillion. So basically, how did all these really smart people get us into this mess? That's what Halberstam talks about. And one of the main characters and actors in this was Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy. He had been the president. He served as the president of the Ford Motor Company for like a week or something. He had been promoted, and then he got the offer right when he got promoted. And basically, McNamara was famous as a statistician. He was a Harvard professor. He had taught at Harvard before the war. And when he was drafted, he served in this elite group of statistical analysts that were called the whiz kids. And then he duplicated that concept when he was the defense secretary. But the original whiz kids were designing like military strategies for the Air Force. And basically, he was then hired. They went as a group to Ford, and he was the smartest of the lot. And he got eventually promoted to CEO. But then Kennedy hired him away to be the Secretary of Defense. And when he was Secretary of Defense, McNamara input into the military a host of statistical controls. He was a huge advocate of management science and statistical controls, and he measured everything by statistics. But the one thing he didn't quite grasp was that you can't get the whole picture just from numbers, that there are always variables that the numbers can't capture. And there's also a concept that, if I haven't mentioned before, I'm mentioning it now, it's very important. GIGO, G-I-G-O, GIGO. It means garbage in, garbage out. And that was fundamental to the problem that McNamara faced with the systems that he implemented in the military. So he lacked, I'd say in a very fundamental way, McNamara lacked common sense. And there's a great movie that was made in the early 2000s, The Fog of War, which I'll talk about. In fact, I highly recommend that you watch it. In The Fog of War, McNamara talks about what he sees as the main issues surrounding war. It's kind of his version of Sun Tzu's Art of War. And basically, he puts a lot of weight on morality, which is fine, but he never quite shook that fixation on measurement. He talks about it is one of the first principles he talks about. But basically, in his own personal career, he was no fool. He wasn't someone who just was a smart guy who lucked his way into the whiz kids and then worked his way up. He was highly manipulative. Yeah, I'm just trying to remember. Tex Thornton, that was the guy's name. Tex Thornton, the guy that organized the Whiz Kids. He was highly manipulative, McNamara, and so Halberstam tells the story that basically somebody came to him and had been offered the job of White House press secretary, and they went to McNamara and they said, should I take the job of White House press secretary? And McNamara said no. And the guy asked him why, and McNamara then proceeded to analyze job after job in the White House. Like, he could go through the whole list of White House job titles and explain how much power they would give you. He had done a power analysis early in his career, if not before, in Washington, and he pinpointed every job, how much power it had, and he concluded that the White House press secretary was a dead end. So that's how conscious of power he was. And not surprisingly, he ended up one of the most powerful people in America in his era. Now, of course, he got into a fight with Johnson as the Vietnam War turned into a disaster. He got into a fight with Johnson and wanted to continue to pursue it, and he didn't. And so he had a falling out, and then went to work at the World Bank, where he spent the rest of his active career until the 80s, I think, or late 70s. He was the president of the World Bank. But basically, he understood power, as did David Rockefeller. David Rockefeller, when he died like a couple of years ago, he was considered, for much of his life, was considered one of the most powerful people in the country. And he was always in the list of the top 10 most powerful New Yorkers. And basically, David Rockefeller, well, he's the great grandson of John D. Rockefeller. And, it was a jumping off point. The Rockefellers had gone into banking after oil, and he was the CEO of Chase Manhattan before it merged, of course. This is back in the day with JP Morgan. But the reason he was so powerful was not just that he was a Rockefeller and the president of Chase Manhattan, although those two things alone would certainly mean he had a lot of power, but he was an incredible networker. And his father had helped establish a group called the Council on Foreign Relations, whose purpose is to advise politicians on foreign policy. They tend to be highly globalist. A lot of the members believe in one world government, not all, but a lot of them, and a lot of the themes of the Council on Foreign Relations is internationalism, globalism, and they've been highly, highly dominant in American foreign policy. Basically, the Council on Foreign Relations had 1,000 members until like 10 or 15 years ago. Then they increased it to like 4,000 or 5,000. But the members include people from all walks of life. It's not just like policy, like foreign policy experts and politicians. It's also, it's founded by business people. So it was Rockefeller, Bernard Baruch, and a long list. I think the Morgans and others, other elite business people of that type founded it. And it's always pushed for a kind of a globalist perspective, which, if you read The Economist magazine or newspaper, they call themselves a newspaper, you get a similar point of view. Or the New York Times as well. And basically, if you look at this group, a group of like 5,000 people, that virtually every president, not virtually, every president since has appointed at least 100 members of the CFR to the State Department. So they have huge power. And Rockefeller himself, his grandfather having been or father, not grandfather, his father having been instrumental in founding the CFR. No, it's his grandfather, John D. Rockefeller, I'm pretty sure, in founding the CFR, was the longest serving president in its history. So basically, as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Rockefeller met thousands of executives, heads of state. His Rolodex, which contained his personal contacts, had 10,000 names, and he extended it by founding a group called the Trilateral Commission, which was supposed to be an educational group. And he was intimately connected to the heads of state around the world, heads of corporations, heads of state, and so on. So basically, he was like a preeminent networker and had tremendous influence on foreign policy through his role as the head of Council on Foreign Relations. So, if somebody says to you, does America have a foreign policy driven by banking interests? You might consider looking into that history, because I think having the most influential foreign policy group was founded by banking interests, and those interests are still involved with it. So, like saying that there's some kind of distinction between banking interests and American foreign policy, I would be pretty hard pressed to find out what it is. So basically, and a lot of media people I add are officers in it as well, as was the speaker. Our speaker, which you should have gone to. I'll bet a lot of people. Did anyone in the class? You can type in the thing. Did anyone in the class go to the speaker event the other day? Abby Joseph Cohn, who spoke to our school, and it was a real. I thought coup for us to get her to speak here, and hopefully we'll get other speakers of equal quality. Did anyone attend that thing? I sent the link around. Let me give you a word of advice. If you want to gain power, a good way is to understand how people like her think and then mirror those ideas. I'm not saying that you need to believe them, but what you should do is, when you deal with other business people, show that you know those ideas, and deep down you might not believe it or not. I'm not trying to influence you politically. I completely disagree with a lot of what she said, not most, but I would say like a third or half of what she said. But that's beside the point. That's not why I read The Economist to believe what they say. I would read it to know what they say, so that when you're doing business with people who are benefiting from these policies, and people like her definitely do benefit from these policies, you know how they think, and you want to move up in that world too. So you're not going to know what someone like that thinks or how they act unless you interact with them. And I was a little surprised that only 50 students came. I mean, I don't know, the students in the class who want to be investment bankers, how you could not attend that is like, I just don't understand. If I'm at work, I would take lunch then. It was at lunchtime, I'd take lunch and listen to it. You're exposing yourself to like one of the preeminent investment bankers in the world. And she's basically she's speaking, when she speaks, it's her opinion, but she's basically giving you Goldman Sachs' point of view. And, it's something you want to, be around. It's not, whatever you're doing instead, it wouldn't have hooked you up with the elite, the way the 1%, if you will, the way attending that would have. So I think more people should have attended. But in any case, and that's how you gain power. If McNamara was a Brooklyn College student, he would have attended. I'll tell you right now, or David Rockefeller. So basically, networking is really crucial, and having certain positions is crucial. So you want to work your way into those positions. That's why they founded the Council on Foreign Relations, so that it gives business, the elite banking interests and upper level business interests, access to. So Abby Joseph Cohn was a member. She said in this thing, she said it initially, that she was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So basically, by doing that, she hooks into a huge network. And that network is how you get power. You get power. Brooklyn doesn't have a lot of fraternities, but that would be a way. Joining one of these secret societies, like if you ever saw the Jackie Gleason show, the Elks, the Lodge, whatever it was in that show, the lodge he belonged to. That basically, you join something like that, you get contacts. The Raccoon Lodge, that's right. There's a bar on the west side. We took the name, the Raccoon Lodge. And basically, it's like a joke, but yes, you do make contacts joining something like that. You do make contacts through your church, mosque, or synagogue. You do make contacts by joining clubs and groups. And while we're at a disadvantage because of Zoom, that you couldn't actually talk to her in person, seeing her firsthand gives you an incredible edge if you want to interview at a company called Goldman Sachs. And so, if you want to hear what she's thinking, you can relay that back to the company. So basically, positions give you power. So getting access to a certain club, which in turn has access to various kinds of jobs, is a good way to gain power. So some of the sources of power are positional as well as personal. The personal powers, expertise, effort, legitimacy, and personal attraction are complemented by the positional sources of power. Things like centrality. Do you have access to information? Are you part of a broad network of interpersonal relationships? I don't have to tell you that if you're the chairman of they call it the secretary of the Council on Foreign Relations, you have access to a broad network of relationships. Both horizontal and vertical networks are important. Informal networks are more important than formal, because informal networks, personal friendships precede formal power. It's how you get power. Once you're in a formal network, you've already been established. So you want to gain that informal power. Second of all, flexibility, the freedom to exercise your judgment. Do you have a job where you're free to think for yourself, at least to some degree? The reason that's important is that you can, it's not to prove you're a philosopher, but to show that you can make good decisions and get a track record. Third of all, visibility. People-oriented positions tend to be more powerful than task-oriented ones. Jobs that are hard analytically tend to be less people-oriented. So being in a position that allows you to interact with a large number of influential people increases your power by making your accomplishments more evident to the people who allocate resources. So, I mean, the fact that Abby Joseph Cohn is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and she said so in her introduction, tells you all you need to know. That those are the kinds of things you need to join in order to get ahead. Relevance means working on activities directly related to your organization. Relevance is very, very important and an interesting issue. There were a pair of management scholars named Pfeffer and Solanchik. Let me put this on the board. And they wrote a book called Power in Organizations, which they also wrote a bunch of research articles. And basically what they say is that if a department is going to become powerful in a company, it has to do something that's really important, that's relevant to the company's chief aim. So, for example, if you are an investment bank, the department that's going to gain the most power is the one that does the investment banking. So, if you know the distinction between line and staff, the distinction between line and staff, let me put that on here. Line versus staff. Line puts their hands on the product, works with the staff is support and advisory. So this comes from the military, where the line is the infantry, the ones who actually fight the battle. In the Air Force, it would be pilots. In 12 o'clock high, it's the guys actually flying. When Savage starts out, he's staff in the beginning. He's at the headquarters advising. When you're actually flying the plane or overseeing the flying of the plane, then you're line. If you're cooking in the kitchen, you're staff. If you're in the Pentagon and you're giving advice, planning, then you're staff. If you're actually on the firing line, then you're line. If you're overseeing the firing line, then you're line. Like the head of it, General Pritchard, he would be considered line because he's overseeing the troops. Actually, it's not clear whether Savage was line or staff. It depends on what his actual role was, which isn't totally clear. So basically, in a company, the line would be the people, if you're a law firm, the line would be the lawyers. The staff would be the people managing the office. In a computer programming, software firm like Microsoft, the computer programmers, the salespeople, the customer service reps, these would all be line. People actually working with the product, selling the product, helping customers, these would all be line people. The staff people would be HR, legal, finance, marketing, to the extent that they're designing marketing strategy and marketing research. Those would be more like the staff people. Okay, now the way that you get power in an organization is through the line. It's where you're doing something directly related to the company objectives. So what Pfeffer and Solanchik studied was universities. They looked at the which departments in a university get power. And they found that there were two kinds that got power. One, if a research university, what are the objectives of a research university? Number one, publication of research. Number two, grants. And number three, getting students in. Okay, so those were the three kinds of departments that gained power. The ones who had the most students, the ones that got the research grants, and the ones that got the publications. Okay, so basically, if the department is doing the things that the university needs, then they get power. Now, what they also found is this, that power becomes rigidified. Once somebody gets power, as Lord Acton said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They want to hold on to power. And so their power becomes rigidified and they begin to pursue power for its own sake. When I talk about Robert Moses, we're going to see that point. Moses did a lot of good things early in his career. He was always manipulative. He was always opportunistic. He was a really smart guy. He did the things that we're talking about in terms of legitimacy, effort, personal characteristics, personal attractiveness, and of course, expertise was huge with him. As well, he figured out how to attain the central position that facilitated acquisition of power. He had a great deal of flexibility. He was highly visible, and he was doing things that were relevant to the aims of New York State at that point in history, between the late 1920s and the late 1970s. So he was in power for 50 years. That's why the title of the book, of his biography by Robert Caro, is The Power Broker. Okay, because he did accrue so much power to himself over a long period, and he sustained it for what would be considered an eternity in politics, in American politics anyway. So basically, doing stuff that's relevant, getting back to relevance, is really important, as Robert Moses was doing. And the departments in the universities that Pfeffer and Solanchik and Pfeffer found gained power were the ones that were doing what's relevant. But power can become rigidified. And if things change and the students stop taking a certain major, for example, in the 60s, everyone took liberal arts. And then in the 70s, it started to change to stuff like business. But the business departments might have had the students, but they couldn't get the power because the liberal arts departments held on to the power. So in other words, then what Pfeffer and Solanchik argued was that if the organization allows the old departments that are holding on to the power, that have rigidified holding the power, if they get to hold on to it, then the organization will tend to die because the newer departments won't be able to get the students, so they'll have a weak department. All right, so basically you want to strengthen the emerging departments, but often there's an incentive of the old departments not to do that. So power can work several ways. If the right people have it, then it can cause the organization to grow. But if it's become an institutionalized power that's not producing the chief organizational objectives, then it can result in decline. And that's exactly why many organizations decline. Organizations go through life cycles and they're unable to change because the people who have power have been doing things one way and they don't want to change. They like what they've been doing, but the world has changed. They don't want to change with the world. So a lot of the biggest companies, what percentage of the Fortune 500 from 1920 still exists? So Fortune 500 still, it was started around the 1920s. Let's see, I'm Googling it. Here's even a more interesting one. What percentage of the Fortune 500 from the year 2000 still exists? That's 21 years ago, probably around the time some of you were born or a little before. What percent of companies, 52% of the Fortune 500 companies from the year 2000 are now extinct. So a minority of companies from just 21 years ago still are on the Fortune 500. And if you look at an older date, 1955, all right, it's only 52. So basically 55 was 65 years ago. So over 65 years, something like 90% of the Fortune 500 disappeared. That isn't because they went bankrupt. Some did. Bethlehem Steel, or many did, but it's also because they were taken over. The other companies that were more dynamic could make use of them. So basically, this idea that corporations have all this power that needs to be addressed by government is nonsensical. One thing that's never disappeared is a government agency. If you look at the government agencies since 2000, probably about 99.9% of them still exist. Those don't disappear. That's where you have monopoly. You don't have monopoly with corporations that come and go with markets. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So if you're trying to gain power as a corporation, you have to be very market sensitive. If you have to gain power as a politician, all you have to do is convince people who aren't that bright that you're going to help them. And when you don't help them, they won't be bright enough to know. All right, so basically converting power into influence is a very big issue. This is kind of an idea that is applicable to American politics. Look at history, you see this over and over again. you compare two presidents who had a lot in common, say Johnson and Carter. They're both Democrats. They both probably had roughly the same social orientation. Johnson's probably a little more conservative, but roughly the same. One was highly effective at getting things done. The other was completely ham-handed and incompetent. Why that is that Johnson, who was able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, for ill, in my opinion, got us into the Vietnam War. Not everyone agrees with me, but I think that was a major mistake. He was able to get things done in a big way, for good or ill. Carter couldn't get anything done. He couldn't figure out how to solve the economic problems. There was the Iran hostage crisis he couldn't figure out. The economy was in a tailspin. Then they had what was called stagflation, and he hired economist after economist who each one had an opposite opinion as to what to do. And finally, at the end, he picked the right one. He appointed Volcker at the very end of his administration, and Volcker raised interest rates. G. William Miller also before Volcker. I'm trying to remember that guy. Miller was the one before Volcker. Yeah, G. William Miller. And basically those two, Miller was kind of transitional, and then Volcker raised interest rates and ended the inflation. He caused a major recession, which is one more example of how stupid Carter was, that he appointed a guy who was going to drastically raise interest rates right before the election. And of course, raising interest rates causes a recession, if not a depression. So you had a major economic downturn right in the 1980 election, which contributed to why Reagan won in 80. So basically, Carter was a complete incompetent, whereas Johnson got everything done that he wanted to get done. It turned out to be terrible thing in part, the Vietnam War, but he got it done. Now, what's the difference between someone like that, Johnson and Carter? Johnson had a better understanding of how to get things done. He understood how to convert power into influence. The skill of transforming power into influence hinges on gaining the consent of others, which engenders support. So it's kind of a more intensified form of how you get power in the first place. So in other words, you gain power by getting elected, but then you turn power and influence by convincing people that they should give you even more power. So basically, there are three basic strategies of influence: turning power into influence, turning power into real power, theoretical power into real power. You look at different presidents, and they had totally different success rates. They had the same power, but some were able to get things done, others weren't. And the same is true of many managers. And the three influence strategies are retribution, reciprocity, and reason. Retribution forces others to do what you say. So if you don't do what you say, I'm going to fire you. If you don't do what I say, I'm going to sue you. If you don't say, I'm going to kill you. If you don't do what I say, I'm going to kill you. You're going to regret it. Things like that. That's retribution. Reciprocity means that quid pro quo, something given in exchange. Quid pro quo means something given in exchange. Reciprocity makes others want to do what you say. I'll tell you what. If you give me an hour of your time, I'll pay you $100. If you do X, I'll pay you Y. You'll receive Y. Reciprocity works a lot of the time. It's not going to work for like intense levels of commitment, but it'll work for most business settings. It works for the employment relationship. It works for hiring contractors. Reciprocity is a good technique. The problem with it is that it costs money. Now, of course, you're not going to get people to work for you unless you pay them. People have to pay their bills and they just can't live without money. So it's absolutely essential. But if you want to get people who work for you to really do what you want, it's better to get them to start to really believe in what they're doing so that they do what they want because they believe it, not just because you're paying them. All right. And that's where it comes to reason. Reason is the third method, that through reason, you help others to see why they should do what you say. I want you to do X because it is consistent with what is right. I want you to do it because you believe in it. Does a basketball or football player or baseball player want to win because you're paying them, or do they want to win because they love the sport and it's the right way to play? They do it because they believe in it. The money is important, but a lot of them would play without the money. Of course, the money, in professional sports, the money is important, but a lot of them, if they weren't professionals, would be playing anyway. So basically, just to go over the three influence strategies: retribution, reciprocity, and reason. Retribution forces others to do what you say. Reciprocity gives someone something in exchange for doing what you would say, what you say. And reason makes people want to do what you say because they believe in it. All right, so basically retribution has a lot of costs. Costs of retribution: people retaliate, they resent your threat, they resist, they figure out a way to sabotage you. Reciprocity still requires some degree of trust. It may generate cynicism. People may adhere to the letter of the law. One of the big problems with incentives is that people will do what maximizes the incentive rather than what maximizes the real purpose of what the incentive is trying to get them to do. So, for example, in school, if I give a test, if I take that test out of the test bank or use a former test, people will study the former test and not bother to study the real material. So they'll memorize the questions and they won't really learn the material. Whereas if I give a new test, they can't do that. So they actually have to study the material to learn it. All right, so basically, incentives have, as a result, are often not the best way to motivate people because it can result in like behavior, like it's kind of like what I said with McNamara with overusing statistics. It gets people to focus just on the narrow definition, and they'll do the thing that optimizes the thing you're trying to maximize, but they won't do the thing that the real purpose is. So basically, reciprocity can lead to an overfixation on a narrow incentive of some kind, and it doesn't get people to do the things that the broad purposes some of the time. Now, just in sum, powerful bosses get things done. Subordinates want to help powerful bosses. They can they can advance their own careers by doing so. The way to get power includes, on a personal level, personal attractiveness, expertise, effort, and legitimacy. On organizational or positional level, You have centrality, um, uh, relevance, visibility, flexibility. What am I leaving out? Centrality, flexibility, visibility, and relevance. I said them all. And basically, the question is, let's say you work for someone and you want to influence them in some way. What might you do? I think a really interesting question is, how can you get the boss to really like you, more than how can you convince the boss to do something you want them to do? I think really the critical thing is getting the boss to trust and like you so that they think highly of you. And if at that point there's something you want to sell to them, that's good. But basically, if you do want to get the boss to do something that you think is a good idea, you have to make clear to them how it matches their objectives. You have to have credibility, and you need to bundle it with objectives that are important to the boss. There are abusive bosses. Some bosses are micromanagers. There can be bosses who are mercurial, who are capricious, who derogate their employees. I've worked for people like that, especially when I was at J&J. There was this guy there named George, who he would hire people and then demote them and put people much younger than them over them, and stuff like that. He was really out to really screw a lot of people. He had no trouble with that. Some of them are obsessed with loyalty. There are a lot of kooky bosses out there. I might have mentioned Babiak and Hare in their book Snakes and Suits describe corporate psychopaths, but in other research, they studied the percentage of corporate bosses who have psychopathic traits, and they found 8% of those of corporate executives have some psychopathy. So basically, you're talking about a large share who are really, troubled. But a lot of bosses have strong power needs and can be abusive, even if they're not psychopaths. It's not a good idea to resist a boss. All right, now that I've disabused you of the idea that life is going to be heaven, it's not a good idea to resist a boss. The textbook summarizes some ways to address retribution attempts against you as an employee. My experience is the best thing to do in that kind of situation is to get out of it, either by changing jobs within the company, or if that's an impossibility, changing jobs altogether. I think abusive bosses, if you stand up to them, there's a real risk of you getting fired. I was watching The Honeymooners with Jackie Gleason and Art Carney from the 50s. It's really hilarious. I just went through, there's only 39 episodes. I went through them. And there's this one episode where Norton, who works in the sewer, is overlooked for a promotion, and Jackie Gleason tells him, just go in there and tell him you'll quit if you don't get the promotion. And he does that, and then he gets fired. So basically, you don't want to do that. So I think using countervailing power is always risky. That's sort of a comic take on it, but I think in a way it's accurate that this idea that you're going to use countervailing power to stop an abusive boss, you can try a little, but I think it's dangerous to do that because they can hold it against you. That, like, if you confront them directly, that they may resent you. If you can confront them subtly without hurting their feelings. But I think a better way is to kind of like mirror what they do and try to win them over by gaining their trust, showing that you care about their feelings and what their priorities are, and then look for a job secretly while you're doing that. That's what I did when I was at Johnson and Johnson. The person who hired me wasn't the person. I thought I was going to work for one person. I went to work for someone else, and then at first I resisted. It was stupid. I realized just go along with them, just do it the same, be a team player, and look for another job. And I did, and I found another job, and and it was a good experience. I learned a lot. I was there for 2.5 years. I learned a lot, and it was a great company, but the circumstances weren't really good. So basically, I don't think you should use countervailing power. I don't think you should confront the individual, and I don't think you should actively resist. I think you should play along with them and look for another job. As far as reciprocity attempts, I would say the book is a little better on that. You should never trust anyone in business. If somebody says to you, I'm going to do you a favor, I'm going to let you in on our team, or I'm going to give you some management help, or I'm going to help you get started, I would look at that like really with a jaundiced eye. I would look at it very suspiciously. You want to examine the intent of any gift giving. Somebody says to you, "Oh, I have a great deal for you, but you have to do it today." A deal that seems too good to be true usually is. Using manipulative tactics should be confronted. So if somebody uses, I meant to say, somebody who uses manipulative tactics should be confronted. Don't bargain with people who use high pressure tactics like, I'm giving you this great deal, I'm going to sell you this great business, but you have to do it today to make use of it. You don't want to deal with such a person, and you want to be careful. If you do business with somebody, you should check their credit record before you sign. Before you sign anything, you should look at the dotted line. Friendship is often hurt by bad business dealings, and trust should always be tempered by due diligence. When you shouldn't trust someone without examining their record, what their past patterns have been, what their credit record looks like, things like that. Okay, so basically, as I mentioned, a really great book to read about power is The Power Broker. The Power Broker centers on Robert Moses, who basically, does anyone know? I'll put it in I'll let the class answer. Who was Robert Moses? Does anyone know? Maybe someone, you can put in the chat or answer it on the microphone if you have one. Anyone hear of it? Oh, someone wrote The Honeymoon. I take it The Honeymooners, you said, was your favorite show. Yeah, I think it still airs on Channel 11. I do believe that, but it's rather astonishing that a 60-year-old show still gets some airtime. But it's got some really classic humor in it. It's not for everyone, but they're a little bit slow. You have to be patient with it. The punchlines are often amazing. The humor. American public official who worked with the New York City. Okay. You read The 48 Laws of Power. Okay, that sounds good too. It sounds like a good book. I haven't read that one. Okay, Moses was indeed a public official, and he did work in the New York metropolitan area, also a lot upstate. He did a lot of stuff upstate in Buffalo and all throughout the state. He had both state and city influence. Long Island was his center, actually. And he started out life, he came from a well-to-do family in New York. His parents had lived in Connecticut, and his father owned a department store, which he sold. And then they lived off the assets in Manhattan. So he grew up in a somewhat privileged community, and he went to Yale. He was a big swimmer, which explains part of his fixation with beaches. And when he went to Yale, he had a friend named Frances Perkins, and she was herself a major figure in American history. She became the Secretary of Labor, was one of the first female cabinet members. I don't think she was the first. There may have been one before her. I may be wrong about that. Frances Perkins, yeah, she was the first female cabinet member and one of the first secretaries of labor. I'm just checking. I don't want to tell you the wrong thing. The first Secretary of Labor was William B. Wilson in 1913. So the Department of Labor had already been established, but she was appointed the first female cabinet member and as Secretary of Labor. And he was her friend. I mean, they knew each other. And she later described him as that they had gone for a walk while he was at Yale, and they were walking down Riverside Drive, and what's now the park, Riverside Park, was at that time a train yard. And so the whole west side of Manhattan, down in the 40s and below, it was the port, which is gone now. But the above, I don't know, 60th Street or something, was the train. It was just a train yard. It was like a dump. And they were walking along there, and he said to her, this was when he was in college, that he was going to build a park there and a highway. And in fact, he did. In a way, he's a little bit like Tesla, who Tesla at an even earlier age, at age 6, read a children's book. He lived in Serbia, and he saw in a picture book a picture of Niagara Falls in a children's book. And he said to his mother that when he grew up, he was going to build a power wheel under Niagara Falls, like a water mill. And indeed, when 25 years later, he built the first hydroelectric generator under Niagara Falls. Like, how these people have that kind of vision is difficult to say. But it was true of Moses, not quite as dramatic as Tesla or, as far reaching, but certainly of huge importance, was that he had this vision for the city. And when he graduated from Yale, he then went for a PhD at Columbia, and he went to Oxford, and then he got a degree at Columbia. And rather than work for a living, and I think this is like one of the really telling things about Moses, is that part of it was he had the resources, but I mean, you can do this in your spare time also, was that he spent all his time in public service. For the first 10 or 15 years of his career, he was working for reform organizations. This was during the progressive era in the early 20th century. There were a lot of National Municipal League and things like that. There were a lot of these municipal associations that were meant to reform government and reform society. And he volunteered his time to work on these different organizations. And one of the things that he did at a certain point was he worked on the redesign of the New York State government, not the the executive branch, not the legislative branch of the judiciary, the executive branch of the government. So in other words, he helped redesign like the agencies and how the reporting relationships and stuff. And he did this for free while he was working for free for one of these municipal associations. While he worked there, he met this woman named Bella Moskowitz, who was a personal friend of the governor, Al Smith. If you've never heard of Al Smith, he played a huge role in New York history and an important role in national history as well. But he was a consummate New Yorker. He was from the Lower East Side, son of Irish immigrants. I believe his father may have been killed working on the Brooklyn Bridge. I'm not sure of that, but he worked from an early age. He didn't have an education. He was a henchman of Tammany. You should have all heard of Tammany Hall if you haven't. Tammany Hall was the political club that ran New York back in those days. And in fact, Tammany Hall ran New York from the late 18th century until the 1930s. And you could say Moses was the last of the Tammany people, or you could say he wasn't a Tammany person. It depends how you look at it. But Smith was very much a part of Tammany. He worked his way up through the ranks of the political club, and he made his way at an early age to be the Speaker of the New York State Assembly when he was in his early 30s. And the head of Tammany at that time, who was in effect his boss, not on paper, but off the books, was a guy named Silent Charlie Murphy. And he realized that the state was changing and the demographics were changing just as they are today. And the ethnic groups were changing and the loyalties were changing. And they had to reform. They had to reform a lot of the abuses that were going on in the sweatshops. So in particular, there was a huge tragedy in a building that's now owned by NYU called the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. And that fire led to the death of 120 women, girls, a lot of them were just girls, who jumped out of the window. They couldn't escape from the fire. The doors were locked. And it led to a factory investigative commission. And then Smith became known as the governor of reform. Well, Moskowitz recommended Moses to Smith, and they became very good friends. Smith was a very well-known governor. In fact, ran for president in 1928. He lost to Hoover, but he ran on the same kind of New Deal policies that elected Roosevelt 4 years later, who was also a governor of New York and was basically riding on the innovations that Smith had made. Roosevelt didn't care to be around Smith too much. There was this whole issue of Catholicism, which today would not be an issue, but back then it was. And Smith was also associated with Tammany Hall, which Roosevelt wanted to get away from. Now, Tammany, through Smith, showed that it could reform itself, but it never really changed. And but of course, Tammany's gone and New York still as corrupt as ever. Cuomo is probably more corrupt than Tammany was, or equally. I read that he's received 100 million in political donations from companies that have received $13 billion in contracts. That certainly rivals whatever Tammany did, if not exceeds it. So, so basically, Smith and Moses became very good friends. They became fast friends. They would have dinner a few days a week and socialize together. And Moses was reaching a point in life where he had to find a job. The family money was running out. He was already well into his 30s. And Smith gave him his first job, which was his first job was the head of the New York State Department of State, the people that run that make sure the corporations are registered and license people and stuff like that. So he was put in charge of that, like he had several thousand employees. That was his first job. So it was through this networking that he got that kind of visible beginning. So you see in that, this concept of centrality, working on things that are important, flexibility, exercising your own judgment, visibility, being around people who can recognize you, and doing something that's related to your organization's needs or that's important socially. These definitely, these positional sources of power worked for Moses early in his career. But of course, volunteering to the extent that he did would be hard for somebody who has to work, but somebody who has to work can do these things in the evening, on weekends, in their spare time. And in a lot of companies, they can even get the company involved. So these things are not doable, but probably not to the same extent. Most of us aren't going to be Robert Moses, but you'd be surprised how some degree of networking can lead to these kinds of results. That's why it amazes me that more people don't attend speaker events and other things of that nature, because that's where you meet people. That's where you learn about how the power structure works through someone like Abby Joseph Cohn. So you want to get involved in stuff like that. That's certainly what Moses did to get his job. So he was working as the head of this Department of State, and he got to gain an insider's view of Albany. And what was true then is true now. The legislators never read the bills. They don't know what laws they're passing. About 10 years ago, Nancy Pelosi famously said, "We have to pass the bill to know what's in it." They were as ignorant in the 1920s as they are today. They pass a lot of laws. They don't know what they're doing. And Moses realized this. Now, Moses was at Yale. He had been on the swimming team. He was almost an Olympic level swimmer. He loved to swim. And he would frequently go to Long Island to swim in the ocean. And he had this vision of building a beach on Long Island. And he set up a bill. He told the governor, his friend, Al Smith, that he wanted to build a public beach that everyone could use. And basically, he wrote a law, and he did this more than once. And he wrote a very complex law establishing the Long Island Parks Commission, whose job was to build Jones Beach, and later built a whole bunch of other beaches. I think about 12 beaches around the city and the state: Orchard Beach, Robert Moses State Park, and on and on. There's a whole bunch of these beaches. And basically, he wrote a law that established the Long Island Parks Commission and appointed him to be the head of it. But in writing the law, he wrote a section that referred to a section that referred to a section that referred to another section that no one ever read any of the sections, and they didn't know what referred to what. But ultimately, it gave him unlimited authority to condemn any property in the state of New York. And he gave himself that property in the law, which was then duly passed by the legislature. And he then became head of the Long Island Parks Commission. He built Jones Beach in the late 20s. I think it was 1928, but I have to check that. 1929. And basically, the beach was something, he did this throughout his career. Like, he demonstrated expertise not only on the political and legal levels. He had a PhD. His PhD was in government or political science, but he also had the ability to design architecturally, and he designed a lot of Jones Beach. If you've been there, probably a lot of people have. You see the results of Moses's design abilities, and he used the same model fairly often. A lot of his beaches, parks, and other edifices follow the same sort of look. You can often see around New York the same style that traces back to his design abilities. So basically, you have that tall tower that looks like Cleopatra's Needle, and you have bathhouses made of brick, and the garbage cans were like portals, so that you throw garbage, like you're throwing it into a portal, and the boardwalk and the facilities all have a certain look to them, and also that they're all very kind of nicely put together. And he designed all this himself, and so he was already showing like this huge expertise. So Jones Beach was like a big hit, and he became a star. But the thing is, people were having trouble getting there. The roads on Long Island at that time were largely back roads. There were, if not dirt roads, back roads. Long Island at that time was mostly comprised of farms, and so there was no suburbia yet, or limited amounts. Queens was probably suburbia, maybe near Nassau and near to Queens, but there wasn't a huge suburban development the way there is now. And it was really hard to get to the beach. So what he said was, well, because I am the head of parks, I am going to build parkways, which are really parks, and they're parks for cars. And the parkway is going to lead to Jones Beach. So he built the Northern State Parkway, and I forget the road that joins it. Is it the Van Wyck, or no? It's past the Van Wyck, whatever that road is that goes down from the Northern State to Jones Beach, and he made them parkways. And this was characteristic of Moses. You see on the parkways these stone bridges that are built according to his design. And if you look at the Northern State Parkway or the Southern State Parkway, you see on the bridges that they're only so high. And the reason he made them like this low height was so that trucks could never go on the parkways. it was very important to him that the parkways be parks. And so he made them with scenery. The scenery is quite lovely on the parkways. But the idea was that the northern state would take people to Jones Beach. What he also did was he then said, wait a second, in order to get to these parkways, and he built also the Henry Hudson Parkway, which incidentally has some of the best views in the city. I mean, when you're driving along that parkway, the views of the Hudson River are wonderful. And that was done intentionally. He designed it for those views. That was his whole purpose of building the Henry Hudson Parkway, was to give people that view in the Henry Hudson Park. So he was building these parkways, and he said to the governor, you know, we have to get people to get access to the parkways, and to do that, you need to build a bridge. But the trouble is that bridges are really expensive. They're big projects that cost a lot. And if you issue a bond proposal to the public, they'll often vote against it because they know, especially in those days, but it's true, it may be even more true now, that there's reason to be suspicious of the government. And so basically the public doesn't particularly favor bond proposals in the voting. So how do you get around that? I want to build bridges, but I don't want it to be up for a vote. So he came up with this idea of the public authority. And the idea of a public authority is that you set up a corporation that's private, but all of the stock is owned by the state. So it's not a part of government, but it's a private corporation owned by the state. And the public authority would borrow from a bank the money and then charge tolls on the bridge to repay the loan. And he started this with the Henry Hudson Parkway, and then he also established the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, which was another one. And he created a bunch of these. And then other ones were started with his oversight, but they were run by other people. But he was personally the head of about 8 or 9 of these public authorities. And the first one was the Henry Hudson Bridge. And they people doubted, you have that 8th Avenue Bridge in Harlem, and people said, why not just go over that bridge? Why would people pay a toll to go over the Henry Hudson Bridge? But they did. And so it was a huge success, and it paid itself off very quickly. So he was establishing these public authorities that owned bridges that would collect tolls that would then make a profit. And he would be the head of them. And then he wrote into the loans and into the charters of these corporations that not only was he the head, but in the loans it said that if the head of the public authority was ever removed, that the loans would be in default. So in other words, he made the free repayment of those loans contingent on his personal remaining in office. So basically, the Triborough Bridge was a bigger project, and basically it had been under construction for years. Tammany had built the Manhattan Tower. The Bronx and Queens parts hadn't been built yet, and they were constantly stealing money from it. Moses took control, and he got it built really quickly. But this this was not quite as important as this was. There was something else he had done a little earlier that was even more important and had very long-term implications for his career. And this goes back all the way to the early 30s and late 20s. As you know, the automobile became prevalent in the early 20th century in America, and large numbers of Americans started buying automobiles in the 1920s as General Motors made purchase of high quality cars affordable through its innovation of the auto loan and the used car market. More and more people were buying cars. Large numbers of people had already bought the Model Ts that were cheap. And so America was becoming awash in the automobile. The problem in New York City was that the streets were built at an earlier period, and the children played in the streets and were increasingly getting run over. This happened in the 19th century with horse-drawn carriages. Children would sometimes get killed, but it was a much bigger problem with the automobile. And so the daughter of Adolph Ox, the publisher of the New York Times, Iphigene Ox, had married Arthur Sulzberger, and he then inherited the role of being publisher of the New York Times. And Iphigene was, like Robert Moses, highly active in these public advocacy groups. People of those days, the rich people in those days were, I think, a lot more socially conscious than today. But in any case, her chief cause, one of her chief causes anyway, was building playgrounds for the children. There were no playgrounds. The children played in the street. You know, if you know that song, East Side, West Side, all around the town, that's really what it's about. It's about the children playing in the street, skipping rope, running around, and unstated in the song, sometimes getting run over by cars. And so Iphigene wanted to build playgrounds. Tammany was far too corrupt and didn't really care about her. Moses, using his authority to condemn properties, built 600 playgrounds, above 600 playgrounds, more than 600 playgrounds in the city. So all the playgrounds that exist today, those were all his construction. And of course, he performed a social good for the most part. The design he originally made was still there when I was young and into my 20s or 30s. But at some point, after 30 or 40 years, the plants had to be rebuilt. The facilities had to be rebuilt, and they revised his design. But he had designed the playgrounds, all had that Robert Moses design. So he built 600 playgrounds. Now, what's really interesting about that, besides that he did this great deed of building all these playgrounds, was that Iphigene Ox Sulzberger then became his greatest admirer. And needless to say, she had a voice in what the Times had to say. And so the Times became a huge, huge backer of Robert Moses. And that's very important because he got involved in a lot of things after the 20s that weren't as great as the things he was doing before. So the roads he was building in the 20s and 30s the beaches on Long Island, the roads, the northern state, the southern state, and of course the expressways, the roads that did have trucks, and the Midtown Tunnel, and on into the 60s, or he built the Verrazano Bridge. All of these things were of great value. You drive on these roads every day: the LIE, the Van Wyck, the Cross Bronx Expressway, and so on and so forth. All of these highways were highways he built. He built over 600 miles of highway in the city. But things got a little bit darker, and we'll see that in the video when we watch the video next week. Things got a little darker as his power base expanded. So if you can picture this, here's a guy who controls the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, who controls the Henry Hudson Parkway, who controls the Queens Midtown Tunnel, who controls all the beaches. And there's huge revenues coming in from these tolls. At first, they're used to pay off the loans, but given the traffic volume, these get to be bigger and bigger over time. And so he's got huge amounts of money, and he can often deploy that money at will. And so he's expanding by creating new public authorities and so on. He's got a huge incentive to further expand the number of roads, further expand the suburbs. And basically, though, what people started to realize was that the more you build the roads, the more people move to the suburbs and the more congested the roads become. So building more roads doesn't end congestion. And roads like the LIE became known as the world's longest parking lot, as more and more people moved to the suburbs and the congestion got worse. But Moses was amazingly fixated on power. And this is important to understand, that as he gained power, the extent to which he became obsessed with power expanded. So like early on, it was already true. Like when he was building the Henry Hudson Parkway, there was still some land in Upper Manhattan that was composed of the original primeval forest that had existed in Manhattan before DeWitt Clinton leveled the island, and John Jacob Astor bought up a lot of it, making himself the richest man in the world, or something close. And DeWitt Clinton created the grid, the cross streets in Manhattan. But after all that, there was still some primeval forest left in the 1920s on the Upper West Side, where Fort Tryon Park is now. And when he was building the Henry Hudson Parkway, there was no such thing as environmentalism in the 1920s, but in an early version of it, a couple of guys got together. These are also like socially aware, wealthy guys, and they started a protest movement to stop the destruction of the primeval forest. And what Moses did was characteristic of him throughout his career. The minute that hit the newspapers, he mowed down the whole forest, and he started plowing the road in. The minute that became an issue, he did not allow any debate. And this was characteristic. When there was a protest movement, he would just start working without allowing the politicians to bollocks things up for him. And I had a student years ago whose grandfather had been the assemblyman in Brooklyn when he was building the what's now the Jackie Robinson Parkway. At that time, long ago, was in my day, it was called the Interborough. And when he was building that road, which was one of the earliest ones, you can tell by the entrances, it's very primitive. There was an early protest movement, and the student said his grandfather always talked about it, how the minute the protest started, Moses just started building it. There was nothing they could do. He just ignored them. And the politicians were scared of him. Why were the politicians scared of him? Because the Times basically had deified him. If you went against him, I mean, he was like the force for reform. And if you went against him, you were a crook. Now, the funny thing is that he was actually an appointee of Smith. So he was a Tammany guy himself. A lot of the old people of that period say he was just another Tammany guy, but basically, no. He did a lot. He did much more than Tammany ever did. The thing is that it ended up, was it any less corrupt? I don't know. That was it less corrupt? I don't know. He achieved stuff with the corruption. There was certainly some corruption. Now, one of the points at which he showed his he was very vicious, Robert Moses. His own brother, he destroyed his own brother's life. He refused. If his brother got a job, he would like call the employer and say, if you give my brother a job, I'm going to make life difficult for you. He did everything he could to keep his brother out of work. And the reason was probably, no one knows, but the reason probably was he saw him as a threat. And basically, at one point, Moses wanted to build a highway from Brooklyn to Wall Street. So in other words, he would have destroyed the park, the Brooklyn Heights Park there, and would have built a bridge. I guess I'm not sure what road goes closest to there, but it would have extended probably to the LIE or something like that, BQE maybe. And basically, Wall Street didn't want it because it would have meant a massive influx of traffic into a neighborhood that's already like bumper to bumper and always has been. And they fought him. Now, Moses rarely lost these kind of battles, but Wall Street is a force unto itself. They're not only a force in the city, they're a force in the nation and a force in the world. And if you said to me that there's no greater force in the world, I would probably say I can't really argue with you. So basically, Wall Street stopped him from building the bridge. But although they were able to stop him, he was able to retaliate against them pretty well. What he did was, at that time, the aquarium was located in what's now Battery Park. The aquarium was in the fort. I think it's now an immigrant museum in Battery Park. And people would go there at lunchtime. People loved the aquarium. People in the Wall Street area loved the aquarium. They would go there at lunchtime and, relax. And Moses closed the aquarium and he then moved it to Brooklyn, where it is now in Coney Island. I remember when it opened. I went there the week like within maybe a year of its opening. I remember when it was new. And he got into this huge battle because he was then going to raise the fort. And the fort isn't city or state property, it's federal property. And basically the fort is a huge historical interest. It's where Lafayette gave a thank you speech to America when Lafayette was old, this hero of the American Revolution, who had helped win who was himself shot in the leg at age 19 as a volunteer on behalf of America, and then was a major force in the Battle of Yorktown, the decisive victory of the war, and also played a role in New York, the military stuff in New York. And basically, when he got old, then he was part of the French Revolution. And when he got old, he was poor, and he came to America, and people thanked him by giving him a large sum of money. For those days, $500,000, and thanked him for his service. And he gave that farewell speech at the fort. And Moses wanted to tear it down. And Roosevelt wasn't about to let him do that. Roosevelt by then was president, and he hated Moses. He hated Moses from the time when he was governor. And he knew Moses was a force unto himself and couldn't be defeated. So he sent the army to protect the fort. Franklin Roosevelt did. And so the army surrounded the fort. Moses sent his bulldozers to mow down the fort, and the army stood there and prevented them from approaching the fort. That's what it came to between those two. So he was, and although Roosevelt beat him in that one instance, when it came time when it came time to open the Triborough Bridge, which Moses had built, Roosevelt came and acknowledged Moses's achievement along with everyone else. No city or state got more money during the New Deal from the Works Projects Administration than New York. That tunnel under the Helmsley Spear Building in the 40s, that Moses built that. What used to be the Coliseum, it's now gone. On the west side, that was also Moses's. And as well, after the war, in the early 1960s, he built Lincoln Center. He built the United Nations building. And there are pictures of him with every president from Hoover to Eisenhower, every mayor in that period, from LaGuardia to Wagner, and to Lindsay, really, and every governor in that period. And there's also pictures of him with people like Franco, the dictator of Spain, with Queen Elizabeth, with the Pope, and they all seem to be bowing to him rather than the other way around. And basically, what did he have to do with Queen Elizabeth? He built this enormous power dam, St. Lawrence Seaway, and this enormous power dam north of New York State in the North Country up there, and that was built jointly with Canada, which is of course part of the British. I forget what they call it, the British Empire. So it's like they're no longer governed by Britain, but they're sort of the Commonwealth, they call it. And she came to honor the opening of the power dam. So what did he have to do with Francisco Franco? The World's Fair. He did the 1964 World's Fair was all his. So basically, he had this tremendous power into the 1960s. And a lot of it was going south by then. The city was in decline. We're going through a similar period now, I think. Crime was on the rise. People had left the city in droves. And there are a lot of parallels between the 60s and early 70s, maybe late 50s to early 70s, but certainly the 60s, and now with people leaving the city, a rise in crime. Basically, Lindsay was elected, I guess, in the early 60s, 65, I think it was, or 6. And he wanted to get rid of Moses. Moses had screwed up the New York City World's Fair. I was a loser, losing financially. It was great fun. I went to it a number of times as a kid. It was great fun to visit, but it was a failure financially. And basically, Lindsay wanted to get rid of Moses, and he sent an emissary to Moses's lair, which was on the island in the East River, Governor's Island, I think it's called, and Randall's, I think it's Randall's Island. That was his, Randall's Island. And that's where the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority is located. He used that as his central headquarters. He was actually the head of like 7 or 8 of these public authorities, and he had 4 or 5 other jobs. He had like jobs that are held by 12 people now, both the city and the state level. 12 jobs he held, and Lindsay sent an emissary to Moses to tell him it's time to resign. Of course, there was always the issue of the bond covenants, that if he was removed, that the bonds would be in default. And Lindsay sent this emissary, and the guy said, it sounded like Moses was talking in code. He said, well, we'll meet in Albany, but he wasn't clear, and he said it was a certain night and so on. So Lindsay flew up to Albany at the appointed time. And instead of a private meeting with Moses, there was like a public event occurring. And the public event in the assembly chamber was a night in honor of Robert Moses. And in his book, Cairo calls this chapter the Parade of the Power Brokers. And he says that every important person in New York, bankers, politicians, Cardinal Spellman, the heads of the unions, everybody. You can imagine the construction unions, these unions that were working on these bridges and tunnels and roads, how much quid pro quo had been going on with these massive contracts, electricians and plumbers and people who built the Triborough Bridge, and all this stuff. There, one after the other, these banks and construction companies and unions and politicians and everybody giving a speech and supporting Robert Moses, one after the other. And Lindsay was actually one of the speakers. And when he realized what Moses had done to him, he gave a few words and then flew back to the city. But that didn't prevent Moses eventually from losing power in the end. But the way he lost it was through the Governor Rockefeller, the brother of David Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller. David Rockefeller's less powerful brother was only a mere governor. And basically, Rockefeller went to his brother, who was probably the most powerful person in finance at that point. And he said to him, if we remove Moses, does it mean that the covenants will cause the public authorities to all go bankrupt? And the other Rockefeller said, no, I'll make sure it doesn't. So they eventually were able to force him out through the power of the Rockefellers. That's what it took. The people who stood up to him were Wall Street and the Rockefellers. Everybody else basically couldn't, with one exception, which you'll see in the video next time, which is that a group of radicals in Greenwich Village were able to stand up to him in a famous battle between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. But rather than start with that now. We'll watch that video next week because we're almost out of time. What I'll do now is just summarize briefly some of the characteristics of Robert Moses that I've just described that fit the analysis. And I highly recommend the book, The Power Broker. It's one of the best books ever written. When I worked for the New York State Assembly in 1991. And my boss said, the best book to read to understand New York politics is The Power Broker. So it's not just the biography of Robert Moses, it's really the biography of New York State and how Moses transformed it and the nature of corruption in New York now, as opposed to the Tammany days. The Tammany days was a different ball of wax. What we have now is a bureaucratized kind of corruption. What existed then was a far more paternalistic. You paid for the coal for the poor people in the winter, and then they would vote for you. Whereas now there's systematized welfare and Medicaid, but you send people. I won't make a bad joke about that, but today we have much more institutionalized corruption there. So basically, how did Moses get power? Through networking, through his relationship with Bela Moskowitz, and most of all, Alfred Smith, the great governor of New York who ran for president. Moses was at the center of a network that he developed as a volunteer in the progressive era, where he made a lot of contacts. He was doing stuff that was central to the importance of New York. Next week, when we watch the video towards the end, one of the commentators says that he gained the power at a time when New York needed these bridges and roads and parks, and he provided them. He was doing something of central importance. And he reached a certain tipping point where what he was doing wasn't all that productive, and it started to really create a mess. And one of the reasons was that Moses was so fixated on this one goal of building roads, and he didn't balance it with a concern for the global economy. By global, I mean global in the city, the economy as a whole. Instead, he was just looking at building roads, building public housing. He built all the public housing, which I haven't talked about. Not some of the public housing, he built most of it. And he built it after the war, and the public housing and a lot of the stuff he did after the war, such as the Cross Bronx Expressway, led to a destruction of the business base in the city, which in turn led to the bankruptcy in the city in the early 1970s. Technically, the city didn't go bankrupt, but that's only on paper. It really did go bankrupt. And it was only because of the power of Wall Street, and they set up the Municipal Assistance Corp, headed by a major Wall Street investment banker from Lazard Frere, which was linked to the Rothschilds. Municipal Assistance Corp. What was his name? I'm forgetting it now. Rohatyn, Felix Rohatyn. I met him once. That basically they oversaw the city's finances for decades. That's why CUNY is part of the state now. It's technically run by the state government. That was part of the reallocation. You only do stuff like that when you've gone bankrupt. The city went bankrupt, and basically its whole finances had to be reorganized. And a lot of it was the corruption around the accounting systems and the misuse of revenues and overspending in the public employees. But a lot of it was also that the revenues had faltered. So many people had left the city. A lot of the stuff Moses did really destroyed the city. Nevertheless, and it's a kind of an example how institutionalized power leads to these kinds of dysfunctions. That's why government is too inflexible to ever be highly efficient. What government can solve problems, but then it becomes rigidified, and the government agencies never dissolve. You have the same government agencies for hundreds of years. And so they're doing the same bureaucratic stuff they did 100 years ago, and it stops being useful. But if you look at his early career, how he got power, did he have expertise? Of course, he created the public authority. He designed all these roads and parks. Did he put in the effort? Of course. He worked 12 jobs. Did he have personal attraction? Probably not his strongest point, but he wasn't the most likable, but he was able to win over the important people. People like Iphigenia Sulzberger, Alfred Smith. He won over the people with power. That's where he was personally attractive. And did he have legitimacy? Well, he was basically, if you attacked him, the New York Times would destroy you. So basically, he had great legitimacy. As far as his positional sources of power, centrality, working on something in a broad network. He had that from the beginning. Flexibility, visibility, and relevance. He had them all. So basically, he's really a great illustration of every principle in the textbook. What about the retribution strategies? Did he use, influence strategies, I'm sorry. Did he use retribution? Yes. Did he use threats? Yes. Did he force things? Yes. He'd build the roads before the public could protest. Did he use reciprocity? Yes. The unions and who knows what other groups that never get onto paper but were involved with construction, the construction unions, the whole union complex was all on his side. The construction companies, the banks that lent the money, the investors in the project, public finance people, all of these people, were hand in glove with him. Was he wired politically? You'll see in the video, one of his best friends, Robert Taft from Yale, also his classmate. Robert Taft, one of the power brokers himself, the Skull and Bone Society, the Tafts were the founders of the Skull and Bone Society, among others, and intimately linked to every facet of American society. Reason, was he able to convince people of the virtue of the things he was doing? Absolutely. People believed he was the one who could get things done. Not that some people weren't worried. There's a story that Cairo tells that one day LaGuardia was sitting in his men's club, and one of his friends says to him, "Why are you so depressed?" And he was dying of ill health. He had cancer, and he said, "Is it your illness?" And he said, "No, I'm not worried about my illness. I'm worried about Robert Moses." He said, "When I'm gone, there's going to be no one who can contain him." And certainly Moses was a pivotal figure in the history of the state. And he used all of these methods of gaining power. He was probably the most powerful individual in the history of the state. So next time we'll watch a video about him, and you'll see how all of this fleshed out in the 50s and 60s, and how Robert Moses went from being this great icon of progressivism to being a corrupt leader. Okay, are there any questions or comments about the material? So you should be reading chapter 5. Your essay revision is due next week. So you should be working on that. And are there any questions about the material? There was a forest in Manhattan at that time, talking about the 1920s. Question, comment? Okay, well, you're free to leave. No, no reason to stick around. The class, if you want to ask questions, feel free. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care, Liana.
Professor, it's Adam. I came late.
Adam. Hold on. Okay, Adam, I got you. Oh yeah, I
Thank
should
you,
ask,
sir.
is Veronica here? Kaylin, Farzine. Okay, I got Adam. Talim, any of
Did
those
you get
people
Nelly?
here? I have you, Nellie.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. It's Veronica, Kaylin, Farzine, and Talim. Those are the absent ones. Any questions, anybody? Nothing?
Hey, Professor. So I spoke to you last week about the informative interview.
Yes,
So
Phoenix.
I've done 7 so far. I have,
Really?
yeah,
That's
I've done,
great.
I've done 7 so far, and then I have 2 more coming up on Thursday, which will be the last ones. So
Fantastic.
basically, I just wanted to make sure that I'm asking all the right questions. So since I only have 2 left, if you could tell me like some questions that are important that I should ask that probably I forgot to ask.
I would say things like, how did you get into this field? Find out what they studied, or ask them if you're doing the right thing in your major. What are some of the ways to get into the field in general? What are the directions the field is going in? What kind of skills will you need for the future in the field? Things like that.
What was the last one that you just said?
What the skills you'll need in the future?
Skills.
How is technology changing the field? What kinds of competition have been most important?
Hold on. How technology is changing. It's changing the field. What was the last one that you said?
How tech, what, well, how things are changing, kind of what skills are becoming important, how competition is changing, what are the things they're competing over. One thing you could ask them is, how's COVID affecting them?
Got it. Okay.
Very
All
good,
right.
Phoenix.
Yeah, but basically everything that I'm getting from them is that the internship. As soon as I get into internship, everything that's gonna change everything for me.
So you're
I'll be
working on getting one?
so I'm just waiting. So basically, what I do is marketing. So I'm just waiting for things to open back up. Things are not open yet because of the COVID thing. So there's no internships available. So internships won't start till like probably September. So I'm banking on that. So but basically the next step is um the internship, and once I do the internship, developing relationships while I do my internship.
Excellent. Sounds great.
Yeah.
You're on the right track there.
Yeah. Okay. And then after the presentation, the next thing is the discussion board. I'm and I'm gonna try to do that because I want the extra credit. So I want to post that first. So I'm gonna watch the 12 Angry Men. Is there anything in particular that I should look out for while I'm watching?
Well, I
it?
think I put a few questions on the,
Yeah,
I'll tell you
I
what,
got those.
I have a list of things somewhere. I'll send you that list.
Okay, cool. All right, perfect. All right. Thanks,
Great.
Professor.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Take care. Have a nice week, Phoenix.
You too.
Other questions? Other questions? Anyone? Have a good day, everybody. I guess there's a few hangers on here. Ending meeting.